What makes Sri Lanka special is the presence of diverse communities that in fact add color to the rich cultural and ethnic fabric of our country. In fact, this is what makes us special as Sri Lankans as well. A very good evening to all our viewers and welcome to The Lost and Forgotten on TV1. Today's topic of discussion will revolve around the Jews who settled here in Sri Lanka, and joining me in the studios this evening as always is Dr. Zameer Careem from the University of Colombo. Very good evening to you, Zameer. Welcome to the show.
Very good evening and thank you, Hassaan, for inviting me.
Zameer, let's start off the show by identifying when the Jews came to the country. Certain historical records suggest that the Jews were believed to have arrived in Ceylon in the 9th century. How far is this statement correct? Do you agree with it?
Okay, so the history of Jews in Sri Lanka can be traced back to remote antiquity. So according to various historians, the biblical Tarshish is believed to have been Gaul, from where King Solomon got his ivory, his apes, peacocks, gold, silver and various other precious commodities, stones were exported from biblical Tarshish, which is Gaul. So some historians believe the biblical Tarshish is Gaul, while others believe that it was Kudrei Malay, which is on the western coast of our country. So King Solomon, who built the first temple, temple in Jerusalem, is believed to have had ties with Ceylon. This is many years back, 10th century BC. And according to an author named Joseph Ingraham in the book The Throne of David, which was published in 1866. So according to this particular book, Ahiram, or Ahiram as he is mentioned, the Phoenician king and ally to King Solomon, is believed to have maintained trade links with Ceylon back then, and he did send his navies to our country as well, and then there were products that were exported from Ceylon to Jerusalem. So since remote antiquity, Jerusalem as well as various other cities of the Middle East, whether it be Baghdad and Jeddah, Medina and all those areas, prior to the advent of Islam, those places were inhabited by the Jews. So there was a significant population of Jews in all these entrepôts. So they did maintain ties with Ceylon, which was referred to as Serendip in ancient times. And then in the 10th as well as in the 9th century, as you mentioned, in 916, so there was this Arabian explorer, geographer who visited our country. This was in the 10th century, 916, referred to as Abu Zayd al-Hasan al-Siraf. So the reason why he came to our country was he was a traveler, he was an explorer. He came from an entrepot known as Siraf, which was a part of the Persian Empire, the Sassanid Empire. And when he visited our island, he noticed that our country was not home to just the natives, the Buddhists and Sinhalese and various other communities, but our country was also home to a significant population of Jews, as well as there were people known as Manichaeans. Manichaeans are those who practiced the ancient Persian religion known as Manichaeism, which is Gnosticism. And there were those who were practicing Judaism in Sri Lanka as early as the 10th century.
Yeah, before we proceed further on the Jews who were existing in the country at that time, interestingly you brought out this biblical reference to one of the destinations that won the attraction of King Solomon, that was Tarshish. And as you rightly pointed out, certain historians believe that it was Sri Lanka. In your opinion, what is Tarshish? Is it Sri Lanka?
Okay, in my opinion, I would say that the historians have quoted saying Tarshish could be Gaul, if not Tarshish could be Kudrei Malay on the eastern coast, and then there was another place from where they got their commodities, the Ophis. So it's believed to be in the Coromandel coast of India. So whether it be Gaul or Kudrei Malay, both these places are located in Ceylon. So biblical Tarshish, in my opinion, was in our country, from where King Solomon got various commodities, as I mentioned. And then later, in the 12th century, there were two explorers who visited our country, and one of the explorers was Muhammad al-Idrisi, who was again an Arabian explorer, geographer and Egyptologist, a cartographer who visited our country in 12th century. And in his famous itinerary, which is called Geography in 1154, he writes that Ceylon was home to a significant population of Jews, and the king of Ceylon, or Serendip as the Arabs identified our country back then, the king of Serendip had a 16-member political council, right? And 4 of those ministers were Jews. The others were Muslims. There were 4 Muslim ministers, 4 Christian ministers, and others were natives. So it is quite evident that back then, I'm talking about the 12th century, at the time of Al-Idrisi's visit to our country during his
This was in the pre-colonial times.
Pre-colonial times, our country was a diverse nation. It has been a diverse country since. Pluralism has been an important factor of our country, and people have lived in friendly brotherhood, pooling the resources of each for the benefit of all. And back then, the Jews held important positions in the king's court.
Yeah, but why did they arrive in Ceylon? What drove them towards Sri Lanka?
As I mentioned earlier, the main reason why the Jews first settled in our country was for trade purposes. So since biblical times, since the time of King Solomon, there were many traders who came from various parts of the Middle East. As I mentioned, even Baghdad was a place which was inhabited predominantly by the Jews prior to the advent of Islam. So there were many who came from the Middle East and settled in our country during various periods of history. And according to my mentor, Deshamanatissa Devendra, who is a Canterbury scholar and former government agent, so according to his research, he says that the king referred to in the records of Al-Idrisi was in fact King Kashyapa IV. So it was during his reign that there were 4 Jews who held important positions in our country.
That was in the 16-member political council.
The 16-member political council, 4 ministers were Jews, others were Christians, Muslims, and the natives of our country.
Let's touch on the settlements of the Jews as well, since you spoke about the Jews already existing in the country by the time the explorers visited the island. What were the settlements of the Jews like? Were they scattered around the country, or were they
must have been
confined
scattered around the country. There is no specific mention of where exactly did they find the Jews. Now, for example, there was another explorer, rabbi, meaning a Jewish scholar, a cleric, who came from a place called Tudela, Benjamin of Tudela, who visited our island in the 12th century. So he identifies Ceylon as the island of Kandy. Probably he's referring to the Candian kingdom. So this was in the 12th century, but there was no Kandy back then, like playing an important role in the history. But anyways, at the time of his visit, he realized that Ceylon was home to a population of Jews, to a substantial population, and he has mentioned that there were 3,000 Jews living in our country. But again, based on various historians, significant number, but some historians surmise that the number was in fact 23,000. Some historians give the number as 3,000, while others have given the number as 100. But it doesn't matter, because according to Benjamin of Tudela, the rabbi, the explorer, when he visited our island, there was a population of Jews in our country, and he also has mentioned in his itinerary that there were worshippers of fire, the Druzes, and various other minority groups, various other religious
groups.
So
were all of them traders, the 23,000, be the 3,000?
He hasn't specifically mentioned what their profession was or what were they engaged in, but I surmise with tolerable authority, and based on archaeological findings and numismatic evidences, I would say many of them who settled in our country pre-colonial era were predominantly traders who came and settled in various entrepôts of our island. And then in the 15th century, again, there was another Italian Jewish explorer, geographer. He's called Farisol, and Abraham is Peristol, that's his name, and he's commonly referred to as Farisol. And in his accounts, he writes that the islands of the Indian Ocean were inhabited by the Jews. Now, he doesn't specifically mention Ceylon, but he writes that the islands beyond Calicut, Calicut is in Kerala, islands beyond Calicut were inhabited by the Jews. So, island beyond Calicut is definitely Ceylon, and Ceylon did have a significant population of Jews back then. And it is believed that there were many communities who settled, and one of the communities, there is a Tamil caste that lives in our country. They're referred to as the Tattar community, Vishwakarma community. So the Tattars, since remote antiquity, have been blacksmiths, goldsmiths, silversmiths. So they are believed to be descendants of the Jews who first settled in our country, right? So then comes the Portuguese colonial period, during which there were many Jews who came mainly from the Iberian Peninsula.
Yeah, why did they visit the country during the period of the Portuguese? Were they brought down to the country by the Portuguese, or did they arrive at their own will?
Okay, so what happened in Portugal at the end of the 15th century, there was this Alhambra decree which was passed in 1492. So in 1492, there were 2 joint monarchs who ruled the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, Queen Isabel and King Ferdinand II. So during their reign, they were Catholic monarchs, so they wanted to expel the Jews as well as the Moors who were living in the Iberian Peninsula, which encompasses countries like Spain and Portugal. So what happened was in 1492, the Jews were forced to convert to Catholicism, as well as the Moors who practiced Islam were forced to convert to Catholicism, and those who refused to convert were expelled from the country, they were executed, they were impaled, they were subjected to religious persecution, many of them were transported to various other parts of the world, and they were subjected to gruesome tortures and were put to slavery. So that was one of the reasons why many Jews who were living in the Iberian Peninsula, this is from 1492 and throughout the 16th century, many converted to Catholicism. And those who converted to Catholicism were referred to as Muranos, right? And these Muranos, they realized that because if they live in the Iberian Peninsula, which encompasses countries like Spain and Portugal, they would not be able to live a decent life because they were suspected of practicing Judaism in secrecy. So because of this particular reason, when the Spaniards as well as the Portuguese established colonies across the globe, these Sephardic Jews, or those who were originally Jews who had converted to Catholicism, or referred to as Muranos, joined the colonial regiments. They came to various colonies like Ceylon in India, Goa, which was the ecclesiastical capital of Portuguese India, and they settled as traders, as part of the Portuguese regiments. So there were many Muranos who came to our country starting from the early 16th century.
So roughly how many Jews arrived in the country during that period?
There is no specific number because they'd already converted to Catholicism, but they were practicing Judaism in secrecy, and they did retain some of the Jewish traditions as well. And they came to our country, and some of the surnames of the Portuguese burghers, specific families, for example, Mirandas, Pintos, Rodrigos, Silveiras, who became Silvas, and many other families in our nation are believed to be of Portuguese origin. So De Fonseca, Costas, and all these few families in our country who are of Portuguese Jewish ancestry. They're referred to as Sephardic Jews, the Muranos, who settled in our country. They married the locals and eventually settled in various parts, especially on the eastern coast of our country, as I mentioned on the episode on the Portuguese burghers. So the Portuguese burghers do have Jewish ancestry as well. So the Pintos, Mirandas,
but
Rodrigos,
where did the Jews originate from? Where did
the Jews originated from, it is believed that from Israel, present-day Israel. So that was the area where the Jews lived, and they lived in the Middle East and various other places. So it's because of religious persecutions during different periods of history that they had to flee and seek refuge in various other parts.
But if I'm not mistaken, Israel was a state that was created later
Israel
on in the
was
20th
created,
century.
this was in 1948 when Israel
Yes.
was created. I'm talking about the time of King Solomon, at the time of King David, and then Israel was divided into two nations, and then it was later occupied by various forces. And during different periods of history, like for example when there was the Achaemenid Empire, I have mentioned on the episode on the Parsis, there was this king called Cyrus the Great. So most of the Jews were captured and they were enslaved by various empires. And Cyrus the Great, who was a Zoroastrian, who was a Parsi, he freed the Jews in Babylon, and those Jews returned to Israel and they wrote the book of Torah, which is the holy scripture of the Jews. But talking about the Portuguese period, there were many Jews who settled in our country. They settled in various parts of our island, and then came the Dutch colonial period. So during the Portuguese period as well, there was this proselytizing, converting people to Catholicism, which was practiced even in our country. So Jews who had married the locals, the Sinhalese, the Tamils, and various other communities who had already lived in this country, they managed to retain some of the traditions while others converted, and it is believed that even some low country Sinhalese families also have Jewish ancestry.
So how was the situation under the period of the Dutch when the Jews continued to live in this country?
Okay, so during the Dutch colonial period, again, there was this whole proselytizing. People were expected to convert to the Dutch Reformed Church, and even from other parts of Europe. Like during the Portuguese colonial period, we had people who came mainly from the Iberian Peninsula. The Jews who had now converted to Catholicism, referred to as Muranos. And during the Dutch colonial period, there were many who came from other parts of Europe, from Slavic nations, from Scandinavian countries, from Central Europe, from various parts of Europe. Those who were Jews or those who had converted to Christianity came to our country, because when the Sephardic Jews were expelled, when they were asked to leave the Iberian Peninsula, some settled in the Ottoman Empire, in Morocco, North African countries and other kingdoms that were ruled by the Ottoman Empire, and others moved to Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So during the Dutch colonial period, again, these Jews who had converted to various religions joined the Dutch VOC as well as free settlers, burghers, as I mentioned.
Did they, just a brief interruption, did they continue to practice their religion in secret under the period of the Dutch?
Some say yes, even during the Dutch colonial period they practiced. I mean, like in the 16th, 17th centuries, those who lived in other parts of Europe, they did practice Judaism in secrecy. Those who converted practiced Christianity, and there were many who came from these European countries during the Dutch colonial period and settled in our nation. For example, there was a professor referred to as Professor Leopold van Dort, who was in fact a professor attached to the Christian Theosophical Society, and he was one among the prominent Jews who lived in our country, and he translated the Quran into Hebrew. Likewise, he also translated unintelligible scrolls into Hebrew, and he maintained good ties with the Jews who settled in Cochin, for example, in Kerala. And during the Portuguese colonial period, there were many Jews who moved from Ceylon to Cochin and other parts of India to survive religious persecution. And when the Dutch came, there were many who came with the Dutch, as I mentioned, the burghers, burghers meaning free settlers, the town dwellers, the citizen of a borough. So those people who came, they also had Jewish ancestry. For example, when we take the Dutch burgher community, like...
So they were not necessarily pure Jews, just
they're
to
not
make it
pure
clear.
Jews, they are of mixed various ancestries, and they were of Jewish ancestry as well. For
What
example,
were the occupations under the Dutch rule?
the Jews.
Yes.
You can't really categorically state that they were Jews. They were those who had converted. You could identify them as burghers, free citizens. So they came to settle in our country.
Did we have pure Jews in the country at that time?
We did have a few pure Jews who lived in our country, but there are no exact records on who were these pure Jews. But when you talk about the Dutch burgher families of Jewish ancestry, there was an author named Karl Muller, that's how he identified himself, but the surname is to be pronounced as Muller, as well as various other professors have kind of found out certain families of Jewish ancestry. For example, the Daniels, the Abrahams, the Josephs, the Martinstein, the Smith, the Schumacher, Oppenheimer, Orloff, Felsinger, Keller, Koch, the famous Koch family. You have many who rose to great prominence. For example, Alston Koch is a singer. E.L. Koch was in fact a medical professor. He was attached to the medical college of our country. The Koch Memorial Tower was built in his memory. Likewise, many from various prominent Dutch burgher families are of Jewish ancestry. So Nicholas and various other families, Nathan, various other Dutch burgher families are of Jewish.
So what religion did they practice in the country?
They practiced the Dutch Reformed Church, Lutherans, Protestants.
It was not Judaism.
It was not Judaism, but there were certain Jewish traditions which some of these Jews, some of these burghers practiced in places like Batticlo, for example, because the Jews, just like the Muslims, they do practice the circumcision ritual. Likewise, just like how the Muslims consume halal meat, the Jews consume the kosher meat. So these traditions, the confinement period and purification rituals that are practiced only by the Jews. So certain rituals were practiced by the Dutch burghers and the Portuguese burghers who lived in certain parts of our country. Likewise, the Tattar community, the Vishwakarma community, as I mentioned earlier, the goldsmith and the silversmith, even some of them practiced. But all these traditions went into abeyance.
What was the situation of the Jews under the rule of the British? As we know, they ruled our country for quite a long time.
Yes.
How was it different to the periods of the Dutch and the Portuguese?
Okay, unlike their predecessors, the British were much more liberal, and there is a specific reason for it, is because there was a British Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, right? So he was of Jewish ancestry. He converted to Anglicanism, but his parents were Jews. So during his premiership, there were many Jews who settled in our country. I would say that the British colonial period was the golden age for the Jews. So there were Jews who lived in the UK or who had moved from different parts of Europe to Great Britain.
So these were Jews, not those with Jewish ancestry?
No, they were practicing Jews who came to our country. For example, in 1841, there were three brothers who settled in our country. The very first brother who came to our nation was Maurice Benedict de Worms. He's called the developer of Ceylon, right? So he came to our nation in 1841. His brother Gabriel Benedict de Worms followed, and then there was an elder brother named Baron Solomon Benedict de Worms. So the de Worms, the three brothers, were the grandchildren of the founding father of the Rothschild dynasty, Meyer Amschel Rothschild. So they were wealthy, extremely influential family. They came to our country, and Maurice Benedict de Worms and the brothers purchased vast extents of land. So they purchased around 2,800 hectares of land in the hill country. Many of those Jews who settled during the British colonial period were planters. So they purchased vast extent of 2,800 hectares.
Were there traders back then as well?
They were involved in trade as well. They did have trading companies. The de Worms, for example, the three brothers owned 12 companies, 2,800 hectares of land. That's around 7,000 acres of land. 2,000 acres was devoted to cultivation, the plantations.
Yeah,
and
just to
6,
clarify, since you brought this point up, saying that the Jews were planters during the period of the British, did the British bring them down to the country, or did they arrive at their own?
It was on their own will that they arrived. For example, Maurice Benedict de Worms, they established their company. They had it in Colombo, down Bailey Street, and there was a depot in Grand Pass. And it was Maurice Benedict de Worms who brought the first tea seedlings, the tea samplings from China, and planted them in his nursery in Pustellava, and that's how tea was, cultivated in our country. But the credit usually goes to James Taylor. He was a Scotsman who came to our country. He was not a Jew. He was a Scotsman who arrived, and he came in 1852, and he started his tea plantation cultivation somewhere in the 1860s. And he is fabled as the developer of tea trade in our country. But he brought his tea samplings from Assam, which is in India. While Maurice Benedict de Worms, this was in the 1840s, he planted his tea samplings, but this was not for trade. He planted it, was some form of an experiment that he carried out in the country, because back then it was coffee that was popular. There were coffee plantations in our country, and it was in 1869 as a result of the coffee blight, and that is what helped James Taylor to develop the tea industry in our country. So prior to that, all these Deworms, they established a famous Rothschild estate. It's still there. It's not owned by these Deworms, but the Rothschild estate still has survived. And they established the Rothschild estate. They were involved in the coffee plantations, as well as Maurice Benedict Deworms had his tea estates as well. And what happened was, because it was not commercially viable in 1862, 1865, during that period, they sold their properties and they moved back to England. They became stockbrokers. And Gabriel Benedict Deworms was the candidate for the Legislative Council of Ceylon. And Baron Solomon Benedict Deworms, he had an impressive collection of Ceylonese stamps back then. So the Deworms family established themselves. There were many planters who came to our country. There was A.C. Mayer, who was also a planter, and during the British colonial period there was a person named Joseph van der Poten, who was a Flemish Jew. He was the first Belgian consul in our country, and he brought plantations in the Highlands, and he was a Jew. Likewise, the Sassoon family, who established the Sassoon Bank, it's no more, but the Sassoon family also owned plantations in our nation. So there were many planters who settled, and many of those planters were identified as Eurasians during the British colonial period, because of the fact that the British who had married the Sinhalese or the Tamils who lived in the hill country, and their descendants were referred to as Eurasians. Though in Europe or in other parts of the world, Eurasian is a term that is used to identify those of mixed European and Asian descent. But in Sri Lanka, during the British colonial period, those of mixed British and Ceylonese ancestry were identified as Eurasians, and there were many Eurasian families of Jewish ancestry. And talking about the Jews who have stamped their identity in our country, two of Ceylon's Chief Justices, Sir Sidney Abrahams and Sir Alan Rose.
Before we move on to that, Zameer, just to clarify on the topic of Eurasians, the term Eurasian is often used as a synonym to identify the burghers as well. How far is this statement correct? Very briefly.
Okay, so during the Portuguese and the British Dutch colonial periods, there were different terms that were employed to identify those of European ancestry. During the Portuguese period, those of European descent were referred to as Muranos, Mestizos, Casados, various other terms. During the Dutch colonial period, they were identified as burghers. And when the British came to our country, in order to create a clear distinction between those of Portuguese and Dutch descent and those of British ancestry, they coined the term Eurasian. Eurasian has been a term which has been used across Asian countries to identify those of European and Asian ancestry. But in our country, the British used the term Eurasian to identify predominantly of those of British and Ceylonese ancestry.
So it was just a fusion of several communities.
Fusion of several communities. In terms of the burgher community, you could say they are of different European ancestry. But in terms of the Eurasian community, if you are to take it into consideration, during the British colonial period, only those of British ancestry, a British person marrying a Sri Lankan and their progeny, were identified as Eurasian. While in other countries, for example in India or in Singapore, if you say you're a Eurasian, you could be from any part of Europe who had married a local, a native, and then their descendants are Eurasians. But in our country, Eurasian was used as a term to identify mainly those who are of British ancestry.
Interesting. Zameer, whenever we talk about various communities on this show, we often make it a point to identify several key personalities from each community who have contributed in any field, be it in the education sector, the health sector, or any other field that we can think of. What were the contributions of the Jews? Would you be able to identify a few key personalities from this particular community who have contributed regardless of any sphere?
Okay, so when we talk about the education sector, for example, there were many Jews who settled in our country during the British colonial period, as I mentioned, and the very first professor of modern European languages at the University of Ceylon was a Jew named Dr. Valerie Reich. Okay, so she was an Austrian Jew, had moved to Great Britain, and it was during the Second World War when that commenced. There were many Jews who came from Britain and settled in our country. So Dr. Valerie Reich was she was an educationist and she was a professor. Likewise, I don't know whether you have heard of this Minister of National Housing and Local Government, Peter Kenneman. And Peter Kenneman's wife, Hedy Kenneman, she was Hedy Stradlin Kenneman, she was a Jewess. So it was Hedy Kenneman, she was also a professor, she was attached to the University of Ceylon as well for a few years. Likewise, there was this professor, famous professor named Professor Ludovic, and his wife, Edith Gromroy Ludovic. She was in fact a psychoanalyst. She was a Hungarian Jewess. She came to our country and she was interested in history and Buddhist philosophies, and she was attached to the University of Ceylon as well. There was another lady named Newman Jubal who was into theatre productions as well. Even Edith Ludovic was attached to various theatre productions. Likewise, Anne Ranasinger, who was born as Anna Litskis. She was a famous poetess. She passed away a couple of years back, and her poems are part of the local syllabus as well. And Marie Mucius Higgins. Now, Mari Musaeus Higgins, according to my mentor, Deshmane Devendra, a Canterbury scholar, he writes that Mari Musaeus Higgins was of Jewish ancestry. While some historians say that because the name Mari is Mary, so she might be of Jewish ancestry, but she was not purely a Jewish person. But it is after her that Musaeus College is named in memory of Mari Musaeus Higgins. So she established various schools and promoted education in our country, and she was involved in writing various books, and she translated various books into English, as well as especially Mahavamsa and Sri Lankan Chronicles was translated to English by Mari Musaeus Higgins. And talking about various others, there were many who were involved in politics as well. There were many European radicals who settled in our country, those who were interested in communism and socialism and Trotskyism and all that. And for example, Edith Ludwig, a feminist. For example, Rhoda Miller de Silva. They were all married to Sinhalese and Burghers and Malays in our country. Rhoda Miller de Silva, Jean Munasinghe, they were all Trotskyist, Socialist, Communist Party members. Likewise, Hedy Kenneman, Peter Kenneman's wife, she was involved, and she played a huge role, especially during the wars and stuff. She helped the people of our country, those who were struck in poverty. And talking about government, judiciary, civil service, there were two Chief Justices in Ceylon who were of Jewish ancestry, and number one was Sir Alan Rose and the other was Sidney Abrahams. Likewise, I don't know whether you have heard of this very famous author, English author named Leonard Woolf, Virginia Woolf's husband, who was an English author as well, and he wrote the book Village in the Jungles. And Leonard Woolf was the assistant government agent of Hambantota, and he maintained strong ties with the Malay Gate Mudaliar, back then Gate Mudaliar Bahar. So Virginia Woolf's husband Leonard Woolf was a government agent in our country, and his sister Bella Sidney Woolf, and she was the first person to write a pocket guide on Ceylon, and this was in the 19th century. And there were many others. There was even one other person named Ulrich Plessner. He was in fact a famous architect who was working with Geoffrey Bawa, and he was instrumental in designing various masterpieces, for example with Bishop's College, likewise St. Thomas's Preparatory School, the Ekal Industrial Estate in Jayala, as well as the chapel of Good Shepherd Convent in Bandaravilla. So all these structures were designed by Ulrich Plessner, and there were many other Jews who have left their mark in this country.
Indeed, Zameer. Zameer, when we talk about the Jews, we know that they practice Judaism. How did they practice their religion in the country, given the fact that they did not have to convert starting from the period of the British? Very briefly, how did they practice their religion in the country?
They had the liberty to exercise. There was free exercise of religion during the British colonial period, especially for the Jews, because they were an influential community. They had their synagogue, the Rotunda, which was down Stewart Place, opposite the Cinnamon Grand Hotel, and it was later raised, and on the very site where the Rotunda stood, they built the Sakrakawa Hall. So Rotunda, you had the Rotunda Gardens, which is named in memory of the Rotunda, which was a Jewish synagogue. It was demolished somewhere in the 1960s. And even if you go to the Borella Cemetery, you will find tombstones with the Yiddish, Jewish, Hebrew inscriptions. Likewise, there is even a Shabbat right now. Shabbat is a place of worship for the Jews, and there is a Shabbat right now, which is down Green Path.
Is it being used nowadays?
It's used. There is a resident rabbi as well, and I'm not sure
after the
pandemic.
But I think that brings us to our next question. Yes. Where does the population of the Jews stand in the country?
There is no specific number in terms of, even during the British colonial period, there were many Jews who settled, and some of them moved to India and various other places, especially after we gained independence in 1948, and then when Israel gained independence as well, many made Aliyah and left the country. Aliyah is act of giving up or the ascent. So that is going back geographically and metaphysically, moving to Israel. Migration. So what happened, there were the Jews who were living in our country back then, because they had established various businesses, so they were in fear that those businesses will be nationalized and they'll not get the right compensation. So many left our country and moved to Israel upon the creation. How many Jews are in the country at present? At present, you don't have a specific number, but prior to the gaining of independence, there were around 100 Jewish families in our nation. Majority of them did move to Israel, and those who settled in our country were mainly those who had married the Burghers, the Malays, the Sinhalese and the Tamils, settled in our nation, and they are descendants of Jewish ancestry. Though they may not be practicing Judaism, there are those of Jewish ancestry, whether the Burghers, the Eurasians, even the Malays and Burghers who are living in our country. There are a few families of Jewish ancestry who still live in our nation.
Thank you very much, Zameer, for that wonderful insight into the Jews who settled here in Ceylon. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but we will be prepared to provide you more information on several other communities that's coming your way next Friday at 9:30 p.m. on TV1 as well. Until next time, have yourselves a great week ahead. Take care, stay safe, and God bless.